Hi, and welcome to Ones and Tooze, FP's economics podcast. Every week we take a couple data points, use them to try to explain the world. I'm Cameron Abadi, FP's deputy editor, with you in Berlin, Germany. As always, FP's economics columnist and Columbia University professor Adam Tooze is with us in New York. Hi, Adam.
Hi, Cam.
So, first off, a quick word about our live shows that are coming up in just a couple weeks. As I've mentioned before, the show in New York is sold out. At least the live tickets are sold out. That is on September 25th, that show, but virtual tickets are still available. You can find the link to those in our show notes, as always. And then there is our live show in Washington at 6th and I, the historic venue in downtown DC. Tickets for that are still available. You can find the link to those also in our show notes. You'll see there that there's also a special tier of VIP tickets available. If you're interested in hanging out with me and Adam, you should check those out. Again, link is in the show notes. We hope to see you at both shows. So today's episode, it is about climate policy and how it's playing out on both sides of the Atlantic right now. That's a topic, if you've been listening to our podcast, that's obviously been on both our minds for a while. If I can just make a quick personal plug, it's also the topic of a book I wrote that's coming out next week. It's called Climate Radicals, and it's about the tension between democracy and climate policy, how they're increasingly getting resolved outside the normal democratic process. Kind of does a deep dive into climate activism in Germany and compares Germany with the US on policy. So if you like this conversation, you might want to check out that book, Climate Radicals. It goes on sale September 10th. But in the second half of the show, we're going to be talking about Germany specifically. Our first data point, though, is $370 billion. That is the amount in investments in clean energy projects that were included in the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, which was the biggest climate legislation in American history. And yet, climate policy has been curiously absent from the presidential campaign, even though that law was just passed a couple years ago.
Dana, I think the most important and most significant aspect of my policy perspective and decisions is my values have not changed.
Wind, they want wind all over the place. But when it doesn't blow, we have a little problem. This was caused by energy. This was really caused by energy and also their unbelievable spending. They're spending us out of wealth, actually. They're taking our wealth away.
Kamala Harris kind of seems to go out of her way not to mention the law. Donald Trump, in his own scattered remarks on the law, has said he'd like to cut much of the spending. But, typically for him, he doesn't really get into the details. So, yeah, we thought we'd dive into what the current state of climate policy is in the U.S. and this campaign. So, Adam, I wanted to start by asking about this kind of reduced salience of climate change in the current election. And I'm curious how that relates to the IRA. I mean, is this kind of absence of climate policy, in a way, a sign of a kind of political achievement? I mean, has the IRA kind of forged some coalition in the United States in support of this climate legislation, at least tacitly, across lines that were previously polarized? And I'm thinking here of kind of two specific economic constituencies in particular, sort of fossil fuel companies that themselves have sort of didn't lobby against the bill and even very recently, amid this campaign, have sort of come out in favor of it. The CEO of Shell spoke in favor of preserving the IRA. And also big finance, which has also been supporting the bill and has cautioned against repealing it. So, these are big economic constituencies. Is there a kind of new coalition that's been formed in the U.S. by the IRA?
It's really curious, isn't it? And I think the answer, as far as I see it, is in the name and in that word tacit that you evoked. Because though this is the biggest piece of climate legislation in US history, and though Biden in his exit letter brags about this as being the biggest in world history, which one could argue about, in any case, it's clearly a major climate measure. But what did they call it? They didn't call it a piece of climate legislation. And this is significant because when US legislators want to advertise what they're doing, they're not shy about big names, right? So if they're voting money for big bombs with which to defend freedom, then the piece of legislation is called Fighting for Freedom with Big Bombs Act, basically, or something with a good acronym. And they didn't call this the America Saves the Planet Act. because they didn't think it was good politics. They thought it was better to call it the Inflation Reduction Act, which is about as conservative as a construal as you could put on this. They claimed, and the claim at the time was that it was matched by tax raising. The number that you quote, the 370 billion, is the one that's more commonly evoked. Both of them are really quite vague because this is really not a spending program so much as a bunch of tax concessions, and those are costed out. And the estimate is it could run to 370 billion. It could run to far more than that. But instead of, as it were, announcing this boldly as a great spending package, they announced it as an Inflation Reduction Act. They dressed it up as supply-side policy to reduce energy costs and to raise taxes to balance that. And I think in this way, the climate does feature in this election because it's about the cost of living and, in Trump's words, how the disastrous Biden energy policy has driven up costs. And that essentially is dog whistle for anti-green mobilization in the US. Crazy, harebrained, leftist, socialist energy policies making life unaffordable. And the Democrats' answer is in fact that they've done no such thing and have done everything possible, in fact, to keep petrol prices down, which is true. And under Biden and Harris, the US has become the largest oil producer the world has ever seen. And I think all of this adds up to the fact that there's absolutely no consensus in the US on the climate policy in the sense of policy in the strong sense of the words. In other words, a balancing of different priorities and different instruments, which involves real trade-offs. In fact, what there is from both camps is an unwavering commitment to keep the cost of energy down for Americans as far as possible. And there is a new and fragile coalition around subsidizing green, so long as that generates jobs and doesn't include buying Chinese things. And there is also a totally loose budget constraint, which means that unlike in Germany, for instance, when you provide subsidies for green energy, you have to raise electricity tariffs to somebody else to pay for them. There's no logic of that kind at work in Biden's climate policy. And so that, I think, is the sort of extremely limited shift that has been initiated. What has happened is the door has been opened to substantial, even more substantial, because the American government has been subsidizing green energy in various forms for decades, but for more substantial and more long-lasting and in some senses open-ended budget items for green energy subsidy. And for that, perhaps unsurprisingly, if you organize a large giveaway, you can actually find a coalition that will back that. But I don't think it goes any way beyond that.
Yeah, it does seem like that kind of lack of any budget constraint is a big secret of how the IRA works politically. And yeah, also in a way, it's the way it culminates what Obama called the all of the above energy strategy, basically supporting every kind of energy, including fossil fuel energy. They used to brag, I think, about all the kind of goodies they got in the IRA, the fossil fuel companies did. So I do want to look at Trump's promises, though, to essentially repeal the spending involved on renewable energy projects. That's been his kind of line on the campaign trail. But I'm curious whether he will end up facing resistance from Republicans on that attempt to repeal the law. A lot of the spending involved in the law has actually been in red states. If anything, more of that spending's been in red states than blue states that are represented by Republicans. And in fact, this month, 18 House Republicans signed onto a letter, I think, asking the Speaker of the House to spare all these tax credits and all that spending from repeals in a future administration. So how does the politics of this work out in the Republican Party itself right now, Adam?
I think it's extremely unpredictable because on the one hand, there is that simple, rational, material logic that you would think would apply. And it's interesting to hear about that initiative from the House. But on the other hand, you have the example of Texas, which is in many respects the quintessential example of a conservative red state that for decades, ever since the governorship of George Bush, has been a supporter of renewable energy on quite a large scale, had a huge wind boom in the 2000s and has now installed a vast amount of solar. There was a moment earlier this year where, believe it or not, 70% of Texas's electricity was generated by renewables. This is Texas, oil state Texas. Right? So the green electricity revolution is happening in a state like Texas. And yet, nevertheless, even at the moment where this breakthrough is happening, the Republicans in the state house in Texas are actually trying to stunt renewable development and curb it and provide subsidies to gas generators. And so one shouldn't overestimate the force of the materialist logic within the Republican coalition. It's there, it's present. The theory of change behind the Inflation Reduction Act was definitely to play on that and to mobilize it. Whether it'll be sufficient to override the other forces that are at work, the extreme ideological polarization on the one hand and the rampant, know-nothing, destructive fossil fuel coalition on the other, at a local level, it's very hard to call. And what is striking, and you refer to it further up, is that business interests, which have a more unambiguous, if you like, objective function and a more unambiguous relationship to the issue of energy costs, have come out squarely. Both the American Petroleum Institute and the Chamber of Commerce, both are notorious conservative lobby groups on behalf of American business, and what were not previously in any way under the suspicion of being supporters of green energy. Both of them have come out in support of retaining the IRA. They're not constrained by the same inner logics of the Republican Party as, say, the Texas GOP may be. And what's really interesting is that they're defending the IRA, not necessarily for its green ambition, but because everything the IRA was larded with when it passed, right? It was always a portmanteau piece of legislation, as all big pieces of legislation in Congress are. And it included very attractive subsidies for hydrogen as a substitute for gas and coal and oil as a possible new energy source, which, if it is made through renewable electricity and hydrolysis, can, of course, actually be a green option, but that's the more expensive route, and carbon capture. And both of these are potentially of real interest to America's fossil fuel complex, especially if, and this is another wrinkle that one has to understand about modern American legislation, not only does it only pass Congress if it's 500 pages long and offers subsidies to all manner of different interests, but also what it actually amounts to depends on the regulations which are subsequently passed or promulgated by the administration as to what exactly the legislation means. And on hydrogen in particular, this is crucial because there's lots of different ways of accounting for hydrogen production, how electricity is fed into the process, and a less stringent interpretation of the green energy requirements for hydrolysis produces a completely different outcome from one in which you insist that hydrogen production in any given location is matched literally kilowatt for kilowatt by green energy production in precisely the same location at precisely the same moment, so as to avoid the kind of false accounting that can easily go into systems like this. And the business interests know perfectly well that all they have to do, they don't have to abolish legislation or repeal it. All they need to do is to tweak these regulations. And it produces what, from my point of view, is an entirely different and very attractive scenario. And so that's the level at which the Petroleum Institute and the Chamber of Commerce are acting. And this is all that, this sounds terribly conspiratorial. It's all completely out in the clear. Everyone fully understands this game. The Biden administration is playing hardball with the fossil fuel interests over the regulations that go into the hydrogen subsidy element. The outcome is not in the interests of the fossil fuel industry as they judge it. And they would love to have the opportunity with a more favorable administration to revise those rules. So this is the way this kind of regulatory game is played. It's much easier in the US to gut or to modify the operation of a law than it is to full on repeal it. And so that's probably the direction that they will go in. It doesn't mean that they don't, in general, perhaps have developing interests in some sort of renewable energy transition. It's just that their interpretation, that is their interpretation of the fossil fuel interest, will be maximally conservative, not orientated towards net zero goals, and so on and so forth.
So I want to turn to another aspect of the political logic of climate policy in the United States and the IRA specifically, and that is the way it involves opposing Chinese interests, specifically the way it involves preventing China from dominating the industry of renewable energy. That's sort of implicit in the IRA and in other climate policies that the Biden administration has pursued. And it's, been effective in its own way, I guess, in creating some political consensus in the United States. Opposing China is always a popular thing. If we were to take some sort of more specific policies that are being proposed, I was struck by an essay recently written by Brian Deese. Brian Deese is a high-level advisor to the Biden administration and the Obama administration prior to that, is likely to play a big role in the Kamala Harris administration. He wrote an essay in Foreign Affairs making the case for a green energy Marshall Plan. in which basically the United States should support its own domestic energy industry by encouraging other countries to buy U.S. energy infrastructure, et cetera, rather than Chinese. And yeah, the analogy here is the Marshall Plan after World War II, in which a lot of money was provided to Europe to sort of accomplish various economic goals. And I guess I'm just curious what you make of this. I mean, is the United States, first of all, in an analogous position today to the post-war period when it developed that first Marshall Plan?
I'm glad you asked this question, and I realized that, writing notes for the episode to this morning, that the tone of my comments is just sort of unrelentingly negative. So let me just say, up front, that obviously it's a good thing when senior economic advisors, especially folks like Tooze, who are very, very mainstream, come out of the center of private finance or in and out of public service and private finance, when they're embracing the green energy story. Of course, this is a good thing. But it's like there are various types of sort of vice, I think it seems to me, that American policy succumbs to on this issue. And one of them is kind of the boosterism of the Inflation Reduction Act. And it's also its kind of furtive, under the radar kind of quality. And the other is just like the flat out cynicism of the GOP. And then the third type of vice is something to do, I think it's with vanity fundamentally, like sort of historical vanity. And if there's anything that inspires vanity in American policymakers, it's the Marshall Plan, right? It's this sense that once upon a time in the mid-20th century, America did this very, very good thing. And it made a huge difference to the world. And so when you're trying to gird your loins and get, mobilize your energies for a further act of great leadership, of statecraft, as they like to call it now, then, you reference this older history. And ironically, Tooze himself is sort of self-conscious about this and says, there's only so many times you can refer to the Marshall Plan before you introduce a kind of cringe. And what's fascinating about this is where he goes. So normally, especially in the pages of a journal like Foreign Affairs, right, the point about the Marshall Plan will be to defend its high-minded purpose. And, that this is really an act of hegemony that wasn't fundamentally in the short-run interests of American business or American capitalism, but in fact was a macro view of global hegemony, even if necessary at the expense of the American taxpayer and potentially even market share of American business. Because in the long run, the aim is to put the Europeans on their own feet, which in the long run, of course, creates competitors for the US. And what's fascinating about Tooze's reading is that he just goes full new left. Tooze in 2024 is selling the Marshall Plan the way Marxists used to diagnose the Marshall Plan back in the 60s and 70s in the Vietnam era, where you could lose tenure for making the kind of argument that he's making, which is that basically the Marshall Plan was, and the plan that America needs now is essentially just industrial policy for the sake of American business interests as a form of export promotion. It's really quite striking. So it's kind of the current moment, for all its bluster about large-scale action, in fact is a kind of really dark, noir kind of vision of what American policy is about, because apparently that's the only idiom in which one can any longer plausibly speak. And if you go to the high-minded West Wing version of this, everyone's just going to kind of barf or yawn, so you don't do that. So instead you do this hard-boiled thing. But then, of course, the question is, what, from a hard-boiled point of view, are America's actual options? And the question you're asking is precisely the right one, which is that the fundamental difference, of course, is that the United States after 45 may have been ramping up to the Cold War and facing challenges from the Soviet Union and China in Asia, but nevertheless was in a dominant position, completely unlike the position that it occupies today. Again, there's this weird irony where Tooze says, the thing about Marshall is that he came from losing China, quote unquote, the great American trauma of the post-45 period, because he was a key part of the American mission to China, and then launches this program in Europe without making the obvious extension, which is that the failure of American policy in China after 45 turned out to be even more consequential than people at the time realized. So there's this weird kind of presence of history in some really quite hard-boiled form, and then a slide back into conventional bromides about American leadership. And when you try and cash it out as a green energy policy proposal, it's just flat out bizarre, right? And this is for good reason, because Tooze can't, I think, actually face the realities, which would tell you that in all of the key areas of renewable energy right now, America is not just not in the dominant position that it was in 1945, but not even at the races, basically, on electric vehicles, on photovoltaics and batteries. It is so far behind China that the idea that America could lead on any of these policies just makes you kind of choke on your morning coffee, right? It's just, what? Like, this is other worlds. And so then if you look in detail at what he's actually proposing, what are the technologies that he suggests that America push? They're a very odd assortment. It is geothermals, carbon capture, hydrogen, and nuclear, all of which are, amongst folks who are serious about the energy transition, scorned, frankly. These are all also around technologies that nobody believes are really going to be in the driving seat. So this isn't a strategy of front foot America forward guiding the world. It's a back foot strategy of, well, maybe there's some niche for us here in these technologies. And if you ask what the genealogy of that is, why has America got comparative advantage in geothermals? It's because of fracking, right? You know, the technology that translates here is a fossil fuel technology, ditto with hydrogen, right? And the idea that America can somehow steal a march on China in an atomic power, nuclear power, is completely harebrained, because the Chinese, of course, are building at a pace that far, far exceeds anything that's remotely plausible in the West. So the whole thing, for me, has a kind of souffle kind of feel to it. Like, it's the sort of policy that it sounds good for Washington to be discussing at this moment. It's a calling card moment, perhaps, for people auditioning for the Harris team. But as an actual strategy of energy transition, it seems to have practically nothing to do with global realities right now. It's symptomatic, really, of the period, rather than really that we're in, rather than telling us, I think, much about what could be real policy options going forward.
Now I'd like to hear Brian Deese respond. Maybe
so would I. Maybe he'll come to our show in Washington.
I was about to invite him. If you're listening,
if you're free that evening, you're not busy with any important business. Like, get a VIP 17th. Ticket, and then you can come and talk to us.
Yeah, exactly.
We'll give you one.
If you're there, we'll bring you up on stage. For a quick exchange.
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, well, to finish off this segment, though, I wanted to turn to one other aspect of the political landscape with respect to climate policy in the U.S., and that's what strikes me as a sort of curious posture of America's climate activists. You know, by all accounts, the IRA included all sorts of compromises that we've discussed here, and, you know, even by its own accounting, fails to kind of achieve the climate goals the administration sets out that are included in the Paris Climate Treaty. And yet, the leftist climate activists in the United States generally supported the IRA. They came out and advocated for it. The biggest climate groups did. Some dissented, but for the most part, there's been support for it. And that sort of contrasts, in my observation, with sort of climate activists elsewhere in the world who tend to be more strident in their demands and more liable to sort of punish policymakers when they fail to meet the goals that they set. So what do you think accounts for America's climate activist scene and their posture towards climate policy here?
I think there are three things. The first is the most, just obvious, which is realpolitik. Like, I don't think you were in the US camp for the shock of 2020, but it was chaos here. And it was such an incredible relief to have a competent Democrat-led administration and a majority in Congress. There was a bona fide and very real euphoria, and for obvious reasons, because the alternatives were horrifying and the stakes are incredibly high. And the Biden people were actually committed to making a third attempt after Clinton's failure, after Obama's failure, to pass legislation. And they did, right? And that's the fundamental reason. And it's a hugely important reason. And it's one I've preached again and again to European audiences. Do the big legislative act, even if the majority is wafer thin, get that majority, because it gives you, in democratic systems, this huge bonus of legitimacy, which cannot be exaggerated in its significance. And so that's the fundamental reason, and I get it. Like, it's very powerful. The second reason is more surreptitious and interesting, which is that part of the reason the Biden people got buy-in is that they were very, very clever, and not just clever, genuinely inclusive in the way in which they incorporated climate activists into the drafting of the legislation. The legislative process in the US is incredibly porous anyway, right? The IRA wasn't made really by the White House. It was made by teams of people attached to key congressional figures with advice from the White House and a bunch of think tanks. No one really wanted to ask too carefully about which piece of info and which model was coming from where, that crafted this legislation. And there was a transfusion of talent, of expertise, especially from the Warren camp, into the Biden administration, and an openness on the part of key figures in the Biden administration and around Chuck Schumer, for instance, to the input from the climate community, which meant that this was a collective project, including all of the compromises. And what's really interesting about this, I wrote about it at the time, but was kind of almost warned off from speaking about it too openly because it was so sensitive, which is that in the negotiations in Congress with people like Schumer and Sinema, there was a double game going on, which was, okay, what does Manchin in particular need? So what is it we have to give the right wing of the Democratic Party? And on the other hand, what does the climate model tell us that we need to actually achieve the ambitious goals for the reductions by 2030, let alone net zero by 2050? And negotiation like this is driven by what professional negotiators call constructive ambiguity. It's like any other deal. You need one side of the bargain to believe they're getting what they want, and our side of the bargain to know that we're going to get what we want too. And that relies to a considerable extent on opacity. And so what was going on in the background behind the Inflation Reduction Act is that every concession that was being made to Manchin was being costed out in real terms on the best available climate models, with at least 3 separate groups of climate modelers in on this in real time, calculating through, right, if we give this, if we hold on to this tax break, we think our model. And on the basis of that, in the end, the concessions that were made still left the climate expert community thinking this was a huge step forward and a big step in the right direction, and potentially open-ended to even more benefits. Because this is, as Tim Sahay put it, who was one of the key figures in all of this, it was bottomless mimosas. Basically, we were opening a bar for happy hour and saying, come drink as much subsidy as you can whilst the happy hour continues. Right. So that's why there was this buy-in, because the optics are worse than what people think the anatomy of this is, which is it'll deliver. And it's based on a specifically American theory of change, which is very un-European, which is you do all carrots and no sticks. In other words, you don't try to tax, you abandon the efforts of both Clinton and Obama to tax or to do emissions trading, and you just go for subsidy of the new good stuff. The third element, which is the one that really has brought me up sharply, and for me, in my own biography, marked a kind of moment of realization of difference between a European political socialization and an American one, is that, and I hope my American friends will forgive me for saying this, but there is a deep down patriotism and exceptionalism also on the left in the United States. There is a deeply baked in belief that if only America can get its act together, the expertise that's mobilized is formidable and second to none in the entire world. So point 1 and point 2 ticked with the IRA. And then you get to go back to the exceptionalist narrative of America saves the world. And what a relief that is, right? Because that then takes you back to the kind of bedrock assumptions of the American Republic and the project of the American Republic and everything it has meant for radicals, for progressives in this country for centuries, right, back to the founding. And so that's, I think, the really high stakes element of this. And this creates a kind of armature around the Biden administration of a bunch of folks. Well, you may have experienced them in Berlin, Cam. I've seen them in a bunch of meetings, transatlantic meetings, and they do not want to hear criticism of the Biden program, especially not from people they think are friends but have European accents and come with hard technical arguments as to why this is really not all that it's cracked up to be. They just don't want to hear it. It's been bruising at times. You can see this publicly on Twitter, but it happens behind closed doors as well. And it's a real thing. It's been a real eye-opening experience for me to feel the force of this. So this is the reality behind the kind of Marshall Plan moment rhetoric, which is that America's political class can get high on its own supply. They really, really do have drunk the Kool-Aid fundamentally. And the real question is, when can you get back to living the dream? And the IRA was the promise that you could and can. And they were reinforced in this also by the huge impact the IRA had worldwide, the kind of shock and awe effect of it. Oh my God, America has stood up and is doing this huge thing. And oh wow, now everyone else has to scramble to catch up with them. And that, in the mirror of that, then, of course, this sort of pomp and circumstance interpretation really gathered momentum. And then you end up with the full Jake Sullivan, end of neoliberalism shtick, which really doubles down on this and creates this very powerful narrative of an epic change in the paradigm of American economic policy, which a bunch of very powerful and heavily leveraged foundations have been very heavily pushing in the background here. And so there's a large academic and journalist community bought in on this as a story. It's a very interesting historical moment that we've been through and still are in. And that, I think, is what's a very long answer to this question of why it is that the American climate community and the left were, I agree with you, surprisingly uncritical.
Well, we will shift perspective a bit and contrast with the perspective from Germany after a very quick break. Stick with us. Hi, and welcome back. Our next data point is 60 billion euros. That is the size of a special fund for climate policy projects that the German government formed several years ago to much fanfare. That fund was then unceremoniously rejected by the country's constitutional court, which has left climate policy in Germany somewhat adrift. That fund has not been replaced. And despite the Green Party being part of the national government, the country's been struggling to figure out what its climate policy exactly is. We thought we'd try to wade into the matter. So, one thing I find remarkable about climate policy in Germany is that, unlike the US, Germany really does have a broad societal consensus about the facts of climate change. There is a broad consensus across the parties about supporting the Paris climate goals. There is no real Republican Party, aside from the really fringes of the landscape, that reject the Paris Climate Treaty as a whole. And yet, Germany has not managed to pass any kind of legislation with the sweep of the IRA that we just discussed. And I'm sort of wondering whether we should say that Germany's climate policy, despite all these political advantages, has lagged behind America's, and why.
I think there's a really interesting difference here between the public perception, which I completely agree tracks exactly what you've just said, and the realities of the energy transition in the two countries. I mean, your question has prompted me to go to the IEA data, the International Energy Agency data, and actually compare the two. And I'm running a little Twitter quiz this morning as to see whether, once you remove the axes and the national labels, people can actually discriminate between the German and the American renewable energy story of the last couple of years. One crucial thing is, first of all, just scaling, right? So the German economy is about the quarter of the size of the American economy. So a 60 billion euro fund is $280 billion. The original intention of the German Climate Coalition was on the same scale as the IRA. The IRA is over a 10-year period, so that's very protracted. It's also largely in the form of tax subsidies. And the German policy is just part of a suite of policies which the German government has been pursuing for years and which are matched at the European level by further layers of subsidy. All told, almost every assessment of the IRA when compared to the EU's combined package of green energy subsidy. So if you take, say, an advanced country like the Dutch or the Germans, levels of subsidy for green energy in Europe are way higher than they are in the US, and have been for a long time. And it shows in the data. That's what's really interesting. So I've been looking at new installation of renewable energy. So that's new types. So we're discounting bio and we're discounting hydro, and we're just looking at solar and wind. And if you look at the period since 2021, so that's the period of the Biden administration, it's slightly beyond the period of the current German government, but the Germans installed 35 gigawatts of renewable capacity. Last year, in 2023, they installed 18 gigawatts in new capacity in 2023. So how much, you asked, did the US do in the same period? In 2023, according to America's official data, America's installation with the IRA in effect, if not, its defenders would say in full effect, this big bang having happened, drum roll, The answer is 23 gigawatts. So for an economy 4 times the size, with much ground to make up compared to Germany in terms of renewable energy, America installed 30% more than Germany did in 2023. So in fact, relative to the size of the economy and relative to the underlying already installed base of renewable energy, Germany is doing far more last year than the United States was doing. Okay, so the defenders of the IRA will always come back at you and say, well, that's all very well, but it takes time for policy to work. Okay, fine. So what the relevant American authorities expect the install of renewable capacity to be in 2024, they think, broadly speaking, 40 gigawatts. Still not breaking out into stratospheric levels, and with the Germans probably increasing to 25 gigawatts. We would expect, remember, a 4-to-1 difference given the underlying size of the economy, and even more given America's retardation relative to Germany. Instead, we're seeing not quite double, maybe, with the IRA in full stride. So this optic, this sense that somehow German policy is a failure by comparison with the US, really is a creature of, I think, the PR campaign around Biden economics, the way in which the Germans in part instrumentalize the panic around Biden economics to motivate their own policy. Because Germany's in a very different position than the US, because it's been doing the energy transition on a relatively intensive basis for almost 20 years, and it shows in the data. I mean, Germany's electricity supply, according to the IEA, is 43% renewable at this point. This was in 2022, so it's even more now. I think last year it was probably closer to 50% renewable, whereas the relevant figure for the US is 20%. So America's level of renewable energy transition is roughly half what it is in Germany. If you look at final energy consumption, which in the accounting of energy flows is really the fundamental thing, currently in the US, so this includes petrol burned in cars and every single form of energy consumption. For Germany, it's 18% in renewables, and for the US, it's a measly 11%, which is below even, I think, the global level of energy transition. So we're talking about two societies at relatively different stages, with Germany now biting into the truly difficult problems of the energy transition. It's all very well to replace your electricity generating system, right? But when you actually have to insulate and replace the domestic heating apparatus of literally millions of homes, which is what the Germans, this is the problem they bit off and then broke their teeth on. No American administration would dare to touch that, right? Things get really tough, and it's clear that they get tough. Secondly, of course, and everyone will say this, so it's important to acknowledge it, they didn't make things easy for themselves by taking nuclear offline, right? So that really, just if we stay confined to the energy space, is a big decision, because it basically buys life for your coal power. And then thirdly, and this is really crucial if we're just looking at energy and climate policy without considering the Ukraine war, which we should speak about as well, but if we stay focused on climate policy, the fundamental difference is that the EU already in 2005 began experimenting with the non plus ultra of serious climate policy as far as every economist in the world is concerned, which is carbon pricing. Whatever form you do it in, you have, I think there is a consensus, it's the only way to get into the nooks and crannies of a fossil fuel economy, right? You can't do that by a series of glitzy subsidy programs. You have to have some sort of pricing mechanism to squeeze fossil fuels out. The Europeans bit into that problem in 2005. For the first 10 years or so, the system was a joke because it's incredibly politically painful to do that. But in the last 10 years, the European carbon pricing system has really developed teeth. And for the last 2.5 years, the average price for a ton of CO2 emissions in Europe, right, ton of carbon emissions, is 70 euros. This is an unthinkably high price for the American context, where America doesn't even come close. It doesn't have a carbon pricing mechanism. So the idea somehow that European policy is behind the curve is, I think it reflects a whole variety of anxieties about American power, about sovereignty, about the incapacity of European political systems to get their act together at Cream. It has very little to do with the reality on the ground of the actual energy transition.
I also would say it is remarkable how Germany has loosened permitting regulations in ways that the United States has struggled with. I mean, that's
what explains the surge. It's since they've done that you see this huge surge in the German data. Look online; it's really incredible. I put up the two graphs from the IEA, and you'll see that the one that has what you would think of as the Biden economics kink in 2021, 2022, where, as it were, you would expect to see a sudden shift in regime, isn't the American data. It's the German data where you see the sudden regime shift.
And yet, nevertheless, I would say the politics around climate policy have become quite bitter in Germany. I think this is pretty well captured, I think, in the travails of the Green Party, which has really become the bogeyman of all the other parties in the country because of its climate policies. And specifically, in a way, the saga, I guess one could call it, of Robert Habeck, who's Germany's vice chancellor, the former Green Party leader, and the country's first climate minister, which he still is serving as. In a way, he's kind of like a Obama-esque figure for folks who are not familiar with Germany's political scene. He was a professional writer before he became a politician, and he also kind of had a theory for reconciling the kind of activist energy that traditionally informs progressive politics with, some broader societal consensus that would be necessary for broader climate policy, I guess. But it hasn't really worked out. I mean, in that theory, it hasn't seemed to work out for Habeck in the way that he maybe envisioned. The Green Party, again, has sort of been on the receiving end of all sorts of criticism since he's taken office. He said he'd like to be the party's chancellor candidate, but it seems unlikely he will end up winning any national election. So, how have Habeck's Greens ended up getting portrayed as the extremists on climate policy?
Well, I think important to just put this in perspective for folks not that familiar with the German political system. The German political system is proportional representation. Only once in the country's history, in the history of the Federal Republic, has a party broke through the 50% boundary. So Habeck's greatest ambition, realistically, probably was to turn the Greens from a party that scores in the teens to a party that scores between 20 and 30% routinely, whereupon it will become one of the two largest parties in a 6 or 7 party German political system. And that was the plan. And they were quite open about it. You're absolutely right, Cam. Like, that was their ambition. It was a kind of hegemonic plan to assemble a coalition of progressive parties around the Greens. In fairness to them, I think, and fairness to Robert Habeck in particular, because he's been running energy policy in the face of the Ukraine war, the Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And that produced a gas price spike, and gas really matters for the European energy economy, of an absolutely eye-watering kind. Huge surges in gas prices, and the threat actually of blackouts and the failure of gas supply, which they have managed. And he actually received relatively good public opinion points for that, but it has been a huge trial. And anyone who knows anyone who's been involved in that German government knows that has consumed so much of their bandwidth. It's been incredibly difficult for them to really focus on anything else. But I think if we're going to account for the problems they face, we have to look somewhere else, because I think he actually scored highly on the war. It's really with regard to the domestic energy policy agenda that they failed. And in part, this is because this is not simply a policy of all carrots and no sticks. It's not a bottomless mimosa policy. It's actually a policy with teeth. And they proposed this domestic heating law that was just incredibly poorly conceived from the outset. It was circulated, leaked. There's a huge political drama about who leaked it and why they leaked it. But basically, they didn't understand or didn't weigh up or didn't appreciate the way in which society would react when people got the impression that basically from Berlin, a government diktat was coming, which meant that you had to find tens of thousands of euros or dollars worth of money to re-equip your granny's oil boiler, right? This was the nightmare that it appeared somehow these crazy people in Berlin had decided on. Now, they will defend themselves and say, oh, no, that was never really the plan. But what they didn't present, they didn't take people by the hand and say, we've got this mind-bogglingly complex problem. We're going to have to solve it with thousands, tens of hundreds of thousands of local solutions. We need a collective national conversation about how community by community, how we do this. That never happened, right? Or rather, it was reconstructed in retrospect, and they realized later on that really there isn't one heating system for Germany. And so what you really need is literally thousands of local fixes, which have to be basically bottom-up driven. This was a failure of conception, I think, with regard to policy. But the next thing to say is that one shouldn't underestimate the sheer viciousness of German politics. I mean, Germany, with good reason, has the reputation nowadays of being a bit of a model democracy, but it's not a herbivorous place in terms of its political ecosystem, right? These are brutal, tactically cynical, aggressive players, especially on the right wing of German politics. And in the form of the Bild-Zeitung, the tabloid, outlet of the Springer publishing empire, they have a Fox level actor in the German political system with relatively little counterbalance. And those folks have done untold damage to the political culture of Germany. They've done it throughout the history of the Federal Republic. The Federal Republic is not a model democracy because all Germans are model Democrats. It's a model democracy because people fought for it against the polluting, damaging, destructive influence of the right wing. And on this issue, the right wing scented blood, and a coalition formed essentially of the Bild-Zeitung, the Welt, which is the more upmarket version, the AfD, the far right, the CDU in opposition, and the FDP, which is the Liberal Party in the government, but effectively in perpetual opposition to its colleagues. And that foursome has really just derailed the German political conversation about the green energy transition, exploiting this niche. So one shouldn't underestimate, when you say what went wrong. Well, it's not so much that things went wrong as that politics is a bloody business. And the enemies of the Greens, the enemies of the green energy transition saw an opportunity, and God, they have used it. And it's truly perverse because it's very unclear whose interest it serves, except in the extremely short run. There's nothing the German car industry needs more than massive public support to make the transition to electric vehicles. But instead, this coalition is digging in and trying to defend internal combustion engines. It feels American in its quality, but it's actually totally homegrown. This is the politics of the German right all the way back to the formation of the Federal Republic. And they've come a cropper up against that. The Green Party used to be savvier, I think. The Green Party was born out of a severe fight with these people in the 70s and 80s. Robert Habeck comes from a much softer generation, and I think was taken somewhat by surprise by the ferocity of this attack.
Yeah, it's important to say there that Habeck was an intellectual rather than an activist before he entered politics. And I guess in that way, it does seem like there's a kind of, again, an Obama-esque weakness that's evident in this narrative you just told, in the sense that it almost seems like Habeck is very confident in his ability to use dialogue to reconcile positions, and that sort of constant dialogue is almost seems to be his vision for kind of reconciling society towards far-reaching policies. But yeah, obviously, at the end of the day, there's still always trade-offs, and people are going to be losers on issues like this, and not to entirely be aware of that is a pretty telling weakness, I guess I would say. But I guess that brings me to my next question, which is that Germany does have a remarkably diverse climate activist movement. This is, a movement that goes back decades in some ways, but even just in recent years has kind of flourished. It's kind of ecosystem with various different kinds of groups, each of which are sort of acting in parallel with one another towards similar goals, but each of which also has its own theories of political change in service of climate policy. And obviously, you're familiar with this scene. You spend a fair amount of time here in Germany. So I'm curious, what your thoughts are on the climate movement in Germany, and which group you think has the most promising ideas of political change.
But Cam, it shouldn't be me that's answering that question, because your new book, Climate Radicals, is just out. Why our environmental politics isn't working, and it's a fantastically interesting parallel history comparison of strategies of environmental radicalism in both Germany and the US. And so I'm just going to spin that question back to you. We didn't practice this. Cam, in all seriousness, wrote this question down, and it's like, no, you're going to answer this. What do you think?
This is why I'm an editor, Adam, is that I like thinking about these issues and then getting to hear other people answer them.
You did write this,
but
you got this book. Now you wrote this book,
so and now I need to be on the shoes on the other foot. I'm happy to try to answer, but apologies, because this is somewhat flat-footed. So in the book I discussed 3 German climate activist groups that I think are instructive in thinking about the theories of change involved in climate activism across the West, across democracies in general. And so one of those groups is called Fridays for Future. This is the group that follows in the footsteps of the Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg. Most listeners have probably heard of her. What the German group does, inspired by Greta, is to take her individual moral protest and make it into a mass social movement. At the height of Fridays for Future, there were hundreds of thousands of people, not just young people, although young people were at the center of those protests, but people from all walks of life of Germany who took to the streets across the country to protest the lack of ambitious climate policy in the country. They would do this in consensual ways in conjunction with the police. They would announce their protests ahead of time. And again, the scale was larger than any other protest on any policy, really, in post-war German history. And yet, despite all that, I would say the group has sort of been a failure in the sense that not only have the protests died down, but they've died down because of the response that the political system gave. The political system both acknowledged the demonstrations and the mass involvement, and yet it also did what democracies always do, which is sort of find compromises. And the compromises were, frankly, so compromised that they were almost insulting, it struck me, to what the protesters, what the demonstrations were demanding. And the sort of underlying theory here struck me as exposed, as maybe naive in some ways, this idea that public demonstration of support for change and also sort of public demonstration of scientific facts, as if those demonstrations would be sufficient to create the change. I think certainly, at least on the timeline necessary that the protesters were pointing to, was exposed as insufficient. Now, the most active group currently is one called Letzte Generation. That translates to last generation. Their strategy has been very different and much more provocative. They've aimed essentially for disruption, public disruption, social disruption. And the idea is that they could make society so disrupted that politics would have to change as a result. And so starting a few years ago, they started blocking streets in Berlin, major thoroughfares, major highways. They would arrange secretly to meet in various places and then sit down and block traffic, often supergluing themselves to the street, so it made it impossible for them to be removed. This extended beyond Berlin to other cities across the country and also to other kinds of infrastructure, including most recently some airports were shut down across Germany by activists from this group. So there's plenty of momentum behind this group, but the theory about how disruption is supposed to produce political change has also, I think, been exposed as pretty questionable, because what it's really produced is anger among the people exposed to these protests, and then anger among policymakers, or at least opportunistic policymakers who've been willing to channel that anger in ways that actually have led to reversals of climate policy. And when I tried to talk with activists from across this group, they themselves admit that they have trouble connecting the dots between their actions and the kinds of policies that they envision coming to fruition. And I think for me, that raised the question of whether policy change was what entirely they wanted at all. Maybe there were other motivations.
Or moral, right? It's about making a statement before the world ends somehow. Not being passive in the face of what, as their name suggests, you take to be a apocalyptic threat to literally our humanity.
And I think you're right to mention the word apocalypse, because I do think that's a lot of what informs the activists themselves. This idea, again, a scientifically grounded idea, that the climate is changing in irreversible, potentially eschatological ways that are not reversible. And this does not easily line up with our normal democratic politics, like I said before, that is sort of designed to produce compromises of various kinds, to bring various interests together and find ways of reconciling them. That's not a perspective easily itself reconciled with the apocalypse. And so, this book was kind of motivated by this question of how these modes of politics, how they relate to each other, and how those tensions produce the excesses that we are all witness to and that we're all obliged to deal with now as a result.
And then there's the third mode, which will be Ende Gelände and the kind of project of attacking fossil infrastructure, right? Actually trying to target a more classic kind of industrial sabotage, industrial obstruction, whereas Letzte Generation is ultimately trying to shake ordinary citizens awake. The Ende Gelände has a strategy which is sort of more power-centered, isn't it? It's about, blockading coal mines and power stations.
Yeah, and in that way, I would say that the groups that perhaps are most clear-minded in their approach to activism might be the ones that are most focused on destruction.
And that has a tradition in Germany, doesn't it? It goes back to the big protest movements around the atomic reactors in the 70s and 80s, which were very confrontational, that were sort of Germany's civil rights movement, if you like, in the generations of young protesters confronted the police with water cannons and baton charges, and it was very, very heavy.
Yeah, so I discuss this group Ende Gelände in Germany, which has really made a recent turn to trying to specifically target fossil fuel infrastructure and destroy it. And there's a kind of materialist aspect to that theory of change, which involves simply increasing the costs on those who support fossil fuel infrastructure and make it less sustainable directly. And I think there's something bracing to that theory. Of course, the ways it intersects with politics are also unpredictable and have led to all kinds of backlash. So there may be weaknesses in that approach as well.
Well, see, this is where I would I would break a lance for Fridays, to be honest, because it was the combination, perhaps, of the Ende Gelände style occupations and the massive confrontations with the police on the one hand, and the huge political protests, which were very menacing for the Social Democratic government and contributed to the collapse of the Social Liberal coalition of the late 70s and 80s, and ultimately gave birth to the Greens, which then, whether you like it or not, led to the decision to close down Germany's atomic program. And so it had consequences, right, over decades. So, and I think in Brussels, anyway, if you talk to people there, like Frans Timmermans and people like that, who in the Ursula von der Leyen Commission was the Social Democrat from the Netherlands charged with climate policy, you know, as inadequate as that official reformist climate policy may be, there's no question that it was powerfully motivated by the spectacle of hundreds of thousands of European school kids refusing to go to school on Fridays for months on end. It was very, very disruptive to ordinary life in many German cities without the blood-pumping, blood pressure, road rage kind of moments of teenagers having glued themselves to the Autobahn, which is more the letzte Generation shtick. Kids were just refusing to go to school every Friday. And I don't know, I have a more optimistic overall assessment. I can see they all at some level, you know, there's aporia, there's gaps, there's some key missing element. But then I think democratic politics is often like that. It's super messy, and you don't really ever quite know what in the end moves it. But all of these modes of pressure at least raise the pressure, force choice. You know, they won a very important Supreme Court judgment in Germany against the government. I mean, you mentioned the ruling of the Supreme Court on the 60 billion climate fund, but the Supreme Court also ruled that the coalition's policy was inadequate because it was not protecting ultimately the constitutional freedoms promised to future generations of Germans, which was momentous really in terms of jurisprudence, I think, on the climate issue. So maybe this is where my reformism shows through, is that I actually find this a more in the end a more promising story.
And progress is evident everywhere. I don't mean to suggest otherwise. Whether it's sufficient, though, to meet the goals that the activists themselves have set and that politicians and policymakers have officially set, namely the goals in the Climate Paris Agreement to limit warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius. I think that's another question because, you know, the analogy to the protest movements of the 1970s and 80s, you know, at that time, they were talking about one energy source, about eliminating nuclear power, rightly or wrongly at the time. That was their goal. And yeah, they were successful in that effort as practitioners of civil disobedience. But we're now talking about a complete societal transformation of all production across the board and all consumption across the board. And, you know, there's support for that shift in Germany, at least in the abstract. All the surveys show that, and the party landscape shows that as well. But when you get to the trade-offs, all of a sudden the public demonstrations are met by all sorts of other expressions of political realism. And that's true in the EU as well as in Germany, as well as everywhere I've looked on that question. And I think that tension is new.
I think it's totally novel. I mean, this I would entirely agree on. I mean, it's worth saying, isn't it, that it's democracies that actually created this problem for themselves in the first place. It was democracies that drove into existence the global climate political frame. It was Western researchers preeminently that identified this and said, this is the acid test of our collective rationality in the 80s and 90s. And then, yes, you're right. Of course, right now we failed, and then we've gone on failing, and it seems very unlikely that we will reach net zero in a timely fashion. And the consequences of that are spectacular. But that seems to me, one has to think the two-sidedness, one has to think, democracy's creative element in actually even framing this in the first place, along with the frustration of its failure to reach that. But if you think about, if you come from the socialist tradition, if you come from the Marxist tradition, it's not like this will be the first time that democracy has enabled the formulation of a vision of dramatic progress, which then remains fundamentally and profoundly unsatisfied over decades. Of course, the climate crisis is different in the sense it changes the parameters at the biological level, it changes the parameters at the planetary level, and it prejudices the possibilities of all further progress henceforth. But that's that's something to be laid at the doorstep of industrialism and urbanization, not at the doorstep of democracy. Democracy enabled the realization of the scale of this problem. And if you really had to make a defense, you would simply say, look, the acid test of whether or not we're responsive is CO2 emissions per capita. Look around the world. Who has reduced their CO2 emissions per capita since the realization that this might be an issue? And the answer is, unambiguously, the only places that have seen a substantial reduction in CO2 emissions per capita are all the big, rich democracies. It's the United States and Europe, where you see, in the case of the US, a 35% reduction since peak, and the UK, where they're literally about to shut down the last coal-fired power station, a reduction which is closer to 55 to 60% over the period of 20 years, in the face of, as you say, a completely unprecedented diagnosis of a crisis and problem we've never seen before. Nowhere else in the world, there's no regime that comes close to producing that outcome. And it's not only the result of policy by any means. It's to do with cost curves and gas replacing coal and everything else, and it's very partial, and it doesn't extend to any of the difficult bits yet. But the only places that have acted on this are the democracies. So we should extend this. I really look forward to having this conversation in public in Washington. It'll be really great. I hope people come along. It's such an urgent and such a fundamental issue.
Come on out. Obviously, I'd be eager to continue this conversation as well. I love hearing an optimistic Adam on this issue, or at least counteracting my more maybe dour perspective. But conversation will continue, and hopefully see you all soon. Ones and Tooze is written and edited by me, Cameron Abadi, along with Adam Tooze. It's produced by Claudia Tatey, Laura Rossbrow-Tellem, Rob Sachs, and Dan Efron. This show is made possible through the support of foreign policy readers. If you're interested in news and analysis from around the world, consider subscribing. Listeners to Ones and Tooze even get a 15% discount. Just go to foreignpolicy.com/subscribe and use the promo code TOOZE at checkout. That's TOOZE. And listeners, as always, we love getting your feedback. You can leave voice messages on the Ones and Tooze homepage on foreignpolicy.com, or email us, podcast@foreignpolicy.com, or you can tweet us. That's @OnesandTwozePod. Thanks very much for listening, and we'll be back in your feed next week.